Good morning. My name is Anupam Chander. I am a law professor at Georgetown University. So yesterday, a co-founder of Facebook declared in the New York Times that the company is too powerful and should be broken up. Facebook responded that it favored more regulation of itself, but that, quote, you don't enforce accountability by calling for the breakup of a successful American company. The Facebook spokesperson making this starkly American national champion argument was none other than the former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Nick Clegg. And indeed, Facebook is facing increased regulation worldwide. Singapore just passed a law directing Facebook to take down information that the government declares illicit or fake news. I suspect that our own president would very much like that power. Germany, too, has created a law passed a couple years ago that requires social media to remove, quote, obviously illegal content within a span of some 24 hours. In a couple of weeks, we'll mark the first anniversary of the European Union's GDPR, which allows fines of up to 4% of global revenues. Facebook today is likely to face a fine greater than 4% of annual revenues in the United States when the FTC finally issues its consent decree. In a couple of weeks, then we'll all be kind of celebrating or marking this incredible privacy movement across the world. And this is true in goes to Africa, which passed this last month new regulations largely mirroring the GDPR, becoming the 134th country in the world to have a set of data privacy regulations. We're now officially in the era of regulating the internet. So we are thrilled here to have luminaries to consider the questions of how this regulation should look. How should we regulate the internet? Tim Wu, at my far left, is the Julius Silver Professor of at Columbia Law School. He clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer and Judge Richard Posner. Next to him is Sam Sachs, who is the Cybersecurity and China Digital Economy Fellow at the New America Foundation. Tim just returned from China yesterday, and so we have a couple of China experts on our panel. But in the middle is Eli Noam, the Garrett Professor of Public Policy at Columbia's Business School. He holds 4 degrees from Harvard. I'm not sure if it's possible to have more, but there's still probably time. And so he is also the director of the Institute of Tele-Information at Columbia. Victoria Espinel is the president of the Business Software Alliance. She was previously a czar, the IP czar for the Obama White House. And I'm also proud to report that she's a double Hoya, a graduate of Georgetown Law and Georgetown College. Fred Wilson is a partner at Union Square Ventures. He co-chairs Tech NYC, which represents New York's tech industry. So we have an amazing panel. And I will begin by asking questions, and then we'll turn over the discussion to you. So please think about what you might want to ask. So Victoria, I wanted to begin with you. As the GDPR, so I'll come back here. I was trying to gather your attention.
We've lost your mic.
Okay, is it on now? Yeah. Okay, good. So as the GDPR is now coming to its 1-year mark, how is it becoming the de facto global norm? And should it be the de facto global norm?
So I think we need global norms, and I think GDPR is one step towards that. But my organization and the companies I represent, we had been engaged in the GDPR discussion for years as it was going through. So at least for us, there was nothing there that was a surprise. In fact, we had been deeply involved with the European Commission. And I think one of the things that's really positive about the GDPR is that it does move towards harmonizing standards across Europe, which is extremely important. I mean, one of the long-term objectives that we have in my organization is global harmonization. So whether that's on privacy rules, on data localization and digital trade rules, on cybersecurity, building towards harmonization in the United States, harmonization across the European Union, ultimately harmonization across the world is where we want to go over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think GDPR, I don't think we in the United States should cut and paste GDPR for a variety of reasons, but I think having a really strong piece of federal privacy legislation go into effect that is as high a standard and is not inconsistent with the GDPR is really important. One of the great things about the GDPR is that it allows us, the United States, to look at what's happened there and do it even better. So lots of positives in the GDPR. And we need to have that. We need to have a very strong level of privacy in the United States as well, across the country. And then ultimately where we need to get to is, Japan, which has a great privacy regime as well, Europe, United States, and then the rest of the world having consensus on what the fundamentals of privacy protection should be.
It might be better, though, for GDPR to be just cut and paste here in the States, because for small companies, the companies that I work with, it's really hard and expensive to comply with lots of different laws, and it might be better to have one global bad law than a dozen better but different laws.
So I think it needs to be interoperable. So I don't think it should be inconsistent with GDPR, but I think there are parts of GDPR that are probably more complicated for small businesses than a law that we could have in the United States. So I do think it's worth looking at GDPR. GDPR is also drafted, I'm in a law school setting, so I can say this. GDPR was drafted in the context of a civil legal system. So very, very different than the context of a US common law system, and I think having a federal privacy legislation that is certainly not inconsistent, so that companies aren't kind of stuck in the middle of the two regimes, but is drafted in the context of our own common law history and tradition, makes a lot of sense.
Tim?
Well, I think the only complaint some people have about GDPR isn't that it's bad, but doesn't really do much to protect privacy, which is, to some, but I think what some of the American critics are starting to think now are, has some features and so forth, but maybe we could do better in terms of getting away from a user consent model, getting further towards something that's more effective in terms of actual privacy protection.
So you're talking about notice and consent.
Yeah, I think one of the, I think it is good that we're having a conversation, I think, about GDPR, and I understand the claims, but I think, looking at the experience of GDPR, we have to ask whether, as a practical matter, it actually is increasing people's privacy protection, if less people feel less watched, or have they just got a whole bunch of options that nobody's ever really used, or very few people use. That's a substantive debate that's going on right now, I think, or it should be.
Professor Noam?
I kind of, after this, let me be the skunk here. I think it's both procedurally and substantively just a really kind of poor piece of legislation. First, as a process, the fact that Europeans declare this to be a law that has to be basically complied with the rest of the world is the kind of regulatory imperialism. If it came from the Trump White House, the United Nations would convene the Security Council practically on that. Secondly, it is by itself has real problems. For example, the right of access to information that people have, and there's nothing wrong with it, also means that as soon as somebody kind of acquires your ID type information illegally, they can just march into your information and get just about everything that you have the right to also, because who can tell who is you in this kind of environment? So there's some real problems. And the problem of having essentially a harmonized law that works only, and I know industry kind of loves it, but there's always the implicit assumption that this harmonized law will be a law that we like. But suppose that's not the case. And suppose you want to change it, and suppose you see weaknesses. What is the process of changing it? You have to go to Brussels and debate this in some DG or whatever, that they would change it. So procedurally it's bad. In substance, it's a poor law too.
So Samm, You are an expert on China, among other areas of expertise. One of the pioneers in regulating the internet is China. So what can we learn from Chinese internet regulation?
I think many people will be surprised to hear that China studied GDPR extensively and actually wrote a data privacy standard modeled on GDPR that took effect very quietly the same month as GDPR last year. So right now, as we look around the world and we debate how to regulate privacy and secure data, you really have two national models. You have the China model and you have the European model, right? And we can talk a little bit about what the China-specific model is. It's part of a broad, I think that the Chinese legal and regulatory framework for cyberspace is the most comprehensive in the world. It not only has this personal data protection element, in one law, the cybersecurity law, it covers online content, critical infrastructure, supply chains. So it's pretty vast. And right now, this year, the government has made personal data protection a priority. So you have a massive campaign going on right now. 1,000 mobile apps in China are being audited. Their business licenses could be revoked if they are found to have excessively collected personal information. So I think a lot of people are probably wondering, wait a second, isn't this the most advanced surveillance system in the world? And now you're telling me there's a system that's based on GDPR. How do you sort of square these two things? So I think of it as I don't call it privacy, I call it data protection. I think that these are rules that in many ways are being used to crack down on Chinese internet companies that have become very powerful because they have amassed so much data. But there are other tools and enforcement mechanisms that apply to what the government can do. So it's really a split identity for privacy in China. And that's the way that I would look at it.
So what you're identifying is a distinction between the Chinese government's goals with respect to the internet and the internet companies that are based in China. The internet companies aren't clearly the handmaiden of the state in some sense.
Well, isn't it the case that China's monolithic and all Chinese companies are just doing the bidding of the Politburo? That's the narrative right now. And I think that that's false. I think there is much more of a push-pull. Look, if you're an Alibaba or a Tencent or a Baidu, you cannot be successful without the support and the backing of the government. I'm not questioning that. But I think that there is a much more interesting push-pull right now, and particularly when it comes to the power and the influence of these companies and the different regulatory tools that the government is using to kind of keep them in check.
So, Tim, this morning, Kara Swisher, among her various immensely interesting comments, suggested that Facebook was pushing back against regulation in the United States, suggesting essentially that Chinese companies will eat the American company's lunch. It's she or me, and that's the alternatives. What do you feel about that argument? If the U.S. starts cutting back on the power of these American enterprises, does it create a vacuum that will then be filled by Chinese companies?
Yes, that's a great question, something I've spent some time thinking about historically, among other things. It's a bold argument by Facebook to install itself as the national champion of the United States. There's a long history of kind of our regulated monopoly of social networking. Is I think what Facebook is pushing itself towards becoming, the AT&T of sociality forever. Is kind of the direction that their arguments are going. And one of them is to say, yes, if we don't do this, if you break us up or take action that is contrary to our interests, we'll just lose out to China. This is a panel, a lot of people on it, but I would return to American history and think about this last time we faced the same dilemma, which was when we were, the United States and Japan were in very intense competition. At the time, there were two giant American monopolies, AT&T and IBM, which were the most powerful tech companies in the world, and they similarly said, if you break us up or do anything bad, well, you're just going to hand over the future to Japan, because Japan knows what to do. They're supporting their companies. They have this ingenious government that is brilliant and is doing all of this. So what did we do in those cases? Well, we actually went after both companies, tried to break them up. And I think to the long-term health of the American tech economy. I think there's a counterintuitive move that the United States has been very successful doing over time, which is we actually turn on our champions. And we force them to face competition. We force them to do away with their best ways of destroying their competitors, and therefore either toughen them or see them be replaced by somebody better. And I think if we hadn't gone after IBM and AT&T, I don't think you have sort of the personal Apple, Microsoft personal computer. I mean, I don't know how many companies you want to name if we still had IBM and AT&T as the dominant two. And so that's why I agree, you started with Chris Hughes's in the introduction. I think it's time where, it's been about 15 or 20 years. It's time to start thinking very hard about turning on some of the biggest American companies and trying to create room for more competition, more entry. And so I profoundly disagree with that argument. I think it's bad policy.
Can I make
Yeah.
a comment
Yeah,
that?
sure.
I don't disagree that
Trying to figure out how to get more competition in the market, I think that's a very good thing. I'm not sure that breaking up a company is necessarily the most efficient way to do that. You think about telecommunication reform, the more interesting reform is one that didn't really take hold, which was the Telecom Deregulation Act in the 90s that basically said anybody can build a business on top of, the monopolies' wires. And the industry did a very good job of basically, hamstringing that ruling. But if instead of breaking up Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple, we simply said, John Battelle had a great point in the first panel, we simply said that, that users had the right to take their data out of Amazon and give it to Etsy, where I'm the chairman of the board, or take their data out of Facebook and give it to Twitter, where I'm a large shareholder, or if they had the ability to take their data out of YouTube and give it to SoundCloud, where I'm a large investor, that would improve the competitive positions of Etsy and Twitter and SoundCloud against those bigger former competitors. So I think if you really want to, hit these guys on the knees, the way to do it is to force them to give API-level, machine-readable access of their data, which is my data, to third parties who compete with them. Yeah. That would really do it.
Can I add something to that?
Okay, yes.
Because Fred used the word force, and I think though what's important to underscore what he said is to force companies to allow customers to do what they want with their data. One of the things that we're hearing some talk about in Europe is forcing companies to turn over data regardless of whether or not their customers want it. So sort of the idea of compulsory licensing of data because of concerns that US companies hold a lot of data and European companies do not. And that to me seems like a really dangerous policy approach, but very different, I think, if you are saying that companies have to make it easier for customers to be able to port over their data in various ways if they want to.
So Eli, your book is much thicker than Tim's book, and so tell us what you've done. So Tim has a slim book, which I tweeted whether or not Chris Hughes had read his book, which I suspect that he has.
Yeah, he has.
And Eli.
So this book is about who owns the world's media, and it is heavily data-driven. So you'd think maybe she got it about right in the middle. No, it's just muddled. Okay, so for example, the breakup. Let's look at the details here. She wants to break up, say Amazon. She wants to take away from Amazon Zappos, the shoe manufacturer, the shoe retailer that has exactly less than 1%, less than 1/10 of 1% of the US shoe market. She wants to take away the Whole Foods part of Amazon, which is exactly 1/3 of 1/10% of the entire US food retail market. Wow, that's going to change the economy tremendously, right? On the other hand, she's really silent about kind of an obvious kind of parallel, which is Washington Post. Doesn't Amazon own the Washington Post? Oh, no, it's kind of Jeff Bezos, and so that's a big difference, I suppose. So why should not the Washington Post also be divested? But that would be politically inconvenient, so it is not mentioned. Similarly, Disney is not mentioned. Similarly, AT&T is not mentioned. Verizon is not mentioned. So she just kind of focuses on those companies because they are now in the crossfire. And so it's a bit like, you know, the last, I think Hughes, in fact, mentions that in his article, the last football player to jump, to pile on a dog pile in a football game. Everybody else is already there, so it is not particularly risky to do so.
Jeff Bezos will be on the moon by that time, by the way, when that happens.
But if I can just finish that, so that's not enough. At the same time, she wants to have, for all companies that are more than $95 million, she wants to have fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory behavior and pricing. There's only one way to do that, and I speak here as a former public utility commissioner. You have then to establish some regulatory commission that kind of analyzes and approves companies' behavior. There's no other way to deal with fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory. Is that what we want for the internet?
Quick intervention.
I have a question for Tim. I was
Sure,
going to
yeah.
ask you before.
Yeah.
So in Cursed Business,
Yeah.
your latest fantastic book, it was economic policy. It was sending a political message.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious what you've been thinking as you've been seeing the conversation around antitrust. And
Yeah.
does it seem political? Does it seem economic?
No, that's a great
Does it seem
question,
both?
and that's what I think. That's what I believe is the importance of taking antitrust action. I think the most important thing about antitrust is that it serves as sort of final check on private power. You know, it's a sort of separation of powers function, almost a constitutional function. And you know, some of our debate over breakups, we're way ahead of it. Now you're debating. You know, I actually agree with data portability with Fred. I think that would be great. But now we're way into remedies, and it's like we're debating, you know, what would be the right remedy after you've already won an antitrust lawsuit. You know, which is years down the line. I just think some kind of almost existential, fundamental return to the idea that there's sort of a constitutional check on private power is one of the reasons I think it's important to reactivate the antitrust laws. You know, they're basically quiet right now. There hasn't been a Section 2 case of any significance in 20 years now since Microsoft. And I think in tech we have a particularly good record in antitrust of bringing these suits. Microsoft, the big trilogy, Microsoft, IBM, and AT&T, I think all shook these very powerful incumbent companies, shook them up and created these booms. You know, three different booms that were really important. I'm not saying it's the only factor.
Just factually, there were kind of, I couldn't agree with you more that antitrust is not enforced strongly enough, but factually, there have been counter case AT&T and Sprint, and there were several others in which the government, Comcast and Time Warner.
Okay, I'm just saying
So I'm
Section
going
2.
to go Can we get Sam? I'm sorry, Sam has been waiting.
I'm going to have to leave early, by the way. Sorry, guys.
I just wanted to quickly,
Yeah.
Victoria brought up the question of politics, and I think I want to step back even bigger to geopolitics, and I think whether you're talking about regulation of data or antitrust, I'm not an antitrust expert, but I will say that these questions around regulation and enforcement are taking place in a larger geopolitical context, which we can't ignore. And I think that as we think about the great power competition between the US and China, this is going to be bigger than, this is not just a military or a GDP question, but I think of it as a great power tech rivalry. And so the knock-on effects in terms of the global influence of tech companies, innovation, reach in markets around the world, this is where I think that this rivalry between China and the US is going to play out. And so any question around data and enforcement of other regulations has to be also taken in that geopolitical context.
Can I make one comment
Yes.
about antitrust? Antitrust is bad policy because it's capricious and it's political. And you pick who you go after. What instead we need to do is just say, this rule applies to everybody. Everybody. Then we don't say, well, you know, Amazon's okay, but Apple isn't, and Google's okay, but Facebook isn't. It's capricious. It's wrong. We should not do it.
Does data portability reduce the
Congress
power
made a decision,
sufficiently?
and I didn't pass the antitrust laws. Congress did, and you know what I mean. You can't just say they don't exist. I mean.
But they're bad policy. That's what I'm saying. It's
Well, you
bad
can say whatever's
policy.
bad policy. It's still a law of the United States.
But let's
maybe you don't agree with the drug laws. You can't just say.
Let's get rid of it and get better policy.
So Fred's
Well, go
solution,
for it then.
Fred's solution is data portability. Does data portability reduce the power of these giant
I think it's a great
platforms?
remedy. I think data portability is a great remedy, but that's sort of a different. I mean, Fred and I agree on that. But you don't get that remedy without threatening breakup. I mean, I've been an investigator. You don't just sort of walk over and be like, "Hey, how'd you like this?" You have to threaten something that companies care about. You only got the remedies you had with Microsoft when they were afraid of actually getting broken up. And so I think antitrust is the only thing that actually has some steel in it. All these other talks, we're going to scare you with a little bit of privacy regulation that will make people click on 5 more things. Fine, bring it on, I think that the reason I am a believer in the law of the United States, which is the antitrust law, is I think it has this historic role in putting a check on private power. And if you want to repeal that law, you can go to Congress and ask them to repeal it. But it is still the law of the land, and it does suggest that monopolization is a felony.
So I should also report that Tim, having flown in from China yesterday, is also headed to another obligation. And since we're running a little late, he's going to have to leave a little early. So, so as you see him disappear, it's not that he's running off in disgust with the rest of us or where the conversation's going.
Well, that may be true, but it's not. But it's not only that.
Is that the sole reason?
So Fred, I want to turn this around on you, though. You're an investor in many of the world's biggest. They may not be. Some of them are. You're not Microsoft, Amazon. You're not GAFA necessarily. But these are still large platforms: Etsy, SoundCloud, etc. How do we know that when they get the information and they become larger and become rivals, equivalent-sized rivals, they don't really just do the same kinds of things that we might be worried about from these current platforms?
Yeah, I don't want to go back to the argument about antitrust law, but I think that if we had laws that every company has to comply with, that tend to level the playing field and increase the opportunity for new competitors to come in and compete, even with the companies that you just mentioned that I'm involved with, I'm in favor of hypercompetition, and I'm in favor of changing laws that get in the way of competition. For example, the SEC should be shut down. They're terrible for this country because what they do is they make it such that only I or some other wealthy person can invest in a startup, and the average person can't. So what that does is it constrains the supply of capital for entrepreneurs in a way that makes it harder for entrepreneurs. If everybody in the world could invest in any startup, anytime, anywhere, yes, there'd be more scams, but there'd also be way more entrepreneurship, and it'd be way easier to go out and compete with these big companies. So we have rules in this country that basically what they do is they let the big, powerful companies stay in power. This is whoever made the comment about Facebook wants to be the AT&T of social media. That would be terrible, and yet by regulating social media, that's exactly what we're going to do.
AT&T of sociality, right?
Yeah, I agree. You've sort of made the case for net neutrality rules right there, by the way, which are good. We sort of agree on a couple of things like that. And if you could have, I am not against for example, data portability rule or some kind of general. These are called competition catalysts. That's the term, where you try to disable the most obvious ways of blocking your competitors, right? And there's just moves that people know who run big companies to try to keep your main competitors out. And if you try to disable those, I think those are the kind of things I agree on. Net neutrality is an example of that, because what do you do with net neutrality? Well, you get rich enough and you pay off the phone company to block or disadvantage your rival. So I agree that there's a place for those. But I'm not going to back off on the antitrust law, because the reason the antitrust law is important, and I'll say this, is because a company can become so powerful that it is, like AT&T at its height, was essentially a part of government. There was no way government was getting rid of them because they were government. And so it has this sort of constitutional role where occasionally you need some final check on a company that has no other way of being dislodged. So that's my case.
Eli.
AT&T was broken up, and I was totally supportive at the time of it. But the fact is that didn't do the job at all, and therefore it kind of reconstituted itself. did happen was that there were access rules and competition rules and openness of competition, and so the competition did reduce market power. And the
Thanks
same with
very much,
IBM.
Thank you, Tim.
IBM in the end was kind of not touched. Microsoft was ultimately not touched in the United States. What happened was that competitive opportunities were opened, and that is important to do. And here I kind of agree that competition has to be entered into. If Facebook's market power and Google's market power are not based on basically, even if you break them up, the core, these are symptoms of the core market power. The core market power is based on network externalities, on economies of scale, on distance insensitivity, on various other things. And by kind of getting rid of some of their functionalities does not reduce the core of the market power. And that has to be dealt with. And so I cannot see how you can break up the search function of Google itself. And therefore, you have to be able to get to people to give them access into the search functionalities from the outside. There are a variety of ways to do that. My next book will discuss that. In fact, in somewhat shorter, but not much shorter. But basically, the structural solution here is nice and politically sounds good, and it's always kind of nice to say great things about that we should enforce the law. I also agree that the antitrust law is totally subjective, and as the history of the United States is littered with these kind of discretionary things, and discretion, giving law enforcement discretion is always a really dangerous thing. Richard Nixon's White House was very selective in its antitrust enforcement.
But Eli, just a minute ago, you talked about some kind of federal regulatory commission, which introduces a federal body that has.
I wasn't arguing in favor of it. I said that's the only way to deal with that if you want to regulate all platforms in their behavior to be just and reasonable and non-discriminatory. Then you have to set up such a commission. That is not to say, however, that the FCC should not get somewhat more of an extensive powers to deal with some things at the margins.
I want to come back to Fred's comment about hyper-competition and that being the solution. If you look at the Chinese internet landscape, there's a lot more, there's some huge players, but there are a lot of competing platforms. There's a lot of, YouTube-like services, there are a lot of social media services, et cetera. How do you feel seeing the competition in that landscape playing out versus what can we learn from there?
So we all know about Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, but there are some other rising internet platforms. Didi, the ride-sharing app, Meituan, the ByteDance. These are massive, massive companies. I will say, however, that when we think about the startup and the entrepreneurship culture in China, the big companies are still sort of in control of the next wave of technology because they're very aggressively going and buying up those startups. So in some ways, and I think I would argue that that China's internet companies in many ways are rivaling, they are competing with the government. They're more powerful than some government ministries, and this is one area where it's playing out. I don't see the Chinese government going forward and trying to break them up, but they're using other regulatory tools to sort of keep them in line.
You know what's interesting?
US versus China. One of the big important new areas in tech is cryptocurrencies, okay? The US government says that they like cryptocurrencies, but actually their regulatory actions have been horrible to the sector. Chinese government says they don't like cryptocurrencies, but their regulatory actions have let the industry flourish. And now, 80 to 90% of all cryptocurrency trading, 80 to 90% of all cryptocurrency transaction volume is happening in Asia and predominantly China. They have co-opted the next great tech sector from the United States, and it's simply because of regulatory policy. The Chinese have done this incredible job of saying it's bad, but letting it flourish. And we've done this terrible thing of saying it's good and we want it and killing it.
I would argue that may be just because they can't enforce it in some cases as well. It may not just be intent.
Well,
whatever it is, it's
whatever
happening.
The case,
yeah.
Whatever case, the U.S. is right now crippling this industry terribly with regulatory
But I think you
actions.
get at an interesting contrast because the Chinese model in the tech sector has been let it flourish first and then we'll figure out who to back and how to control it, which is somewhat different.
That's a kind of move fast and break things model, no?
That's what we did with the internet.
That's what we did.
The US did that with the internet, and it worked out great.
So let's turn to some questions. There's a gentleman right here.
I'll stop clearly there's chaos, and I'm wondering if, as it was done in the 20th century, where the Japanese government actually was planning for the business community. So I'm bringing that up because clearly there should be collaboration between government and businesses so that there can be check and balances. Because clearly the issue is not going to be easily resolved. And also, what about the interest of us consumers? I'm wondering if it wouldn't be good for us to be able to license our data in the sense that the same way Google is paying people some pennies for ads. Whenever our data is used, we would get a little bit of money so that there is a law that protects that so that we can know what they're doing with our data and we can profit from it also.
Now, the way to do that is simply to give us the ability to own our data, and we can do whatever we want with it. If we want to sell it, we can sell it. If we want to keep it private and not sell it, we can do that. Today, we don't even have that choice. They sell it, they make their money on it. We can't stop it. So the first thing to do is let us own our data and revoke rights to it or provide rights to some third party to monetize it instead or whatever. That's what we need.
So Facebook, I want to remind you, says you own your data.
Bullshit.
Okay, but I just want, and that's the data ownership model. I mean, the scholarship in this area, the legal scholarship in the area, is largely skeptical of a property rights and data approach.
Why?
And so, because it will be alienated immediately, and Facebook will say, "You own your data. Thank you for sharing it with us. We have a perpetual license to use it through all the universes and the parallel universes as well." So I'm gonna keep, we have a large number of questions. Let's go to the gentleman in the very back.
That's you.
Hi everyone, and first of all, thank you for putting this together. I don't know if I need a mic, but all right. Oh, great.
If you could identify yourself, that would be great.
All right, my name is Paul McCulloch. I'm with the New York City Cyber Law Group. Previously, I was an VP of IP and Technology Law and VP of Digital Compliance at JP Morgan. I'm a coder turned lawyer, and you guys said a lot of great things, but over the past 5 years, I've been working with 15 different regulators addressing issues in 5 countries, and you touched upon some things, but I think that approaching it more from a technology perspective raises some different questions, and I'd like to hear your perspective essentially on beyond cooperative groups, beyond the sandboxes. Essentially, the government I love dealing with the most is Singapore. They're prescriptive. If you're trying to get technology to be able to give people their right to data using any sort of referential or asymmetric encryption protocols or what have you, the best way to do that is to have the technology enabled and regulate the technology. So that's when you get structural solutions like automated RegTech solutions, solutions that deal with containerization of laws in certain jurisdictions and dealing with conflict of laws. And then you end up with issues about whether or not, how to audit an ontology. But
so
here's
I'm
my
going to stop
question.
you right there, if that's okay, only just because of the time and the questions. So I'm going to ask the panel, are there some good models out there of countries that are getting it right in particular places?
I think there's other people who are better suited to answer that question.
So we work with governments around the world, and I think it varies issue to issue. I mean, I think policy-wise, I think Japan generally has a pretty good approach. I agree, Singapore, although they are a very specific economy in a very specific state, so I don't think the Singapore model, unfortunately, maybe really can extrapolate out very far. We work with every major market in the world, and I would say there are probably pros and cons to all of them.
But Fred, but he was going to a question. He began with the question that you began with, which is one simple global norm rather than 15 or so jurisdictions that he's dealing with right now.
Well, look, I think a bunch of people on this panel explained why that's not right, and they got me thinking that maybe the better answer is some sort of commonality, some sort of foundational commonality, and then market-specific kind of flavor to it. But the thing we need is, for smaller companies, we need just, like, they really do want to comply, but it gets so expensive.
Fred, that demonstrates that you're not an academic, because you would have stuck with your guns from your first statement.
You know what? I'm the king of strong opinions weakly held.
Okay, excellent. Eli.
Well, the grass is always greener on the other side, and so there's some kind of romanticization of some regulatory regime. So Europeans, for example, have a goal of helping their IT industry. Hasn't worked terribly well. It hasn't worked when they tried to do it with IBM or with Microsoft, and now with the FANGs. And even 100 years ago with Hollywood, which is now being extended in the television regulation, online television regulation, to be kind of the traditional scarcity model of television regulation. But at least there is a certain kind of goal that they have in mind. For the US, I think kind of the system is a reflection of the reality. So, and it's not a bad system. Once you kind of accept this kind of Churchillian type notion of democracy is the least worst of all systems. It's a system with federalism, it's a system with diversity, it's a system where different states and different regulatory bodies can explore and experiment and do. It has its certain weaknesses. For example, the losers are usually not such as kind of workers, fearing for their jobs, cannot really get enough help. The process is money laden, and that's a real problem. This process is hyperventilating. People exaggerate the problems. People exaggerate, vilify their opponents. If you're not with me, you're against me. That kind of stuff. But once you kind of look at the actual bottom line, the U.S. system has actually worked pretty well, and the results of the industry kind of show that, and the results of the consumer level show that, and the marginal type issues which need dealing with, such as privacy and so on, are dealt with perhaps a few years later than Europeans. That's possible, but nevertheless, they are being dealt with.
So we need to strive towards fundamental consensus.
Fundamental consensus. But I like the regulatory floors as opposed to regulatory ceilings and variation across the world, right? I think that does make sense, even if it causes problems for entrepreneurs like the gentleman who spoke earlier. There's a question here, and we have time maybe for a very quick question.
Yes. I'd like to get a sense of what your opinion is of the jockeying back and forth about what is a public forum and a private forum as it applies to these digital giants. There's a case going up that will be decided in June in the Supreme Court, D.D. Halleck versus Manhattan Neighborhood Network, that is a case that has to do with the issue of cable access TV being a public designated forum in the state of New York. However, what has occurred is that all the internet lobbying organizations have entered because they're afraid of the question of public versus private forums being expanded. So what is your knowledge about that? Because that obviously would have an impact on legislation down the road.
So these are questions of content moderation, et cetera.
No, it's about public forum versus private forum. It's a First Amendment issue.
But that's what the question leads to, is what happens with the content that is permissible on these platforms. Eli.
The more market power a platform or a kind of carrier or whatever has, the more for regulatory requirements should be imposed on it. And the more liability should be imposed on it. So I think that kind of there are ways, it's not, in my view, it's not a binary type thing of public versus private, but if the private power is substantial, then certain requirements could be put on it.
All right, well, thank you very much. It was amazing. I would have listened to all of you for the whole day.